Going there with the latest headlines. Well, it is now time for the debate, and for better or for worse, EU leaders have come up with a deal they hope will contain the region's debt crisis. After weeks of heated discussions, the 14th EU summit in less than 2 years finally yielded an agreement, and it's one investors certainly seem to like. Today, we've seen stock markets and the euro both rallying strongly. However, there are some fears that this deal just doesn't go far enough and that it actually fails to address the underlying economic problems of the Eurozone. Well, joining me to discuss tonight is Fabienne Keller. She's a UMP senator, that's the ruling party here in France. She's also a member of the delegation for the European Union. To my left, Harald Hau is a professor of finance at the University of Geneva and also at the Swiss Finance Institute. I'm also joined by Daniela Schott. She's in Berlin. She's a head of research at EU integration. And in New York, Georges Huger is and CEO for the Leo Global Advisors. And he's also the former group executive and vice president of the New York Stock Exchange. Thanks indeed to you all for being with us tonight. We'll start our discussions. Let's have a look at what's been agreed at this latest summit. Here are the three main banks here in Europe that hold Greek debt will accept a 50% loss. They will lose half of what they were expected to get back from their holding in Greece. The Eurozone's main bailout fund, we've talked a lot about this in recent days, the FSF, it is set to grow from around 440 billion euros to over €1 trillion. And banks here in Europe must also raise more capital, and that's aimed at protecting them against future losses which will be incurred by government defaults, as we've been fearing might happen to Greece. Well, here's what the European leaders behind that deal had to say about it earlier.
We had a long and intensive, fruitful discussion. I was aware, and everybody was aware, that the whole world was watching this meeting. We showed the world that we can guard ourselves from this deep economic crisis. I think that we Europeans took the right measures tonight.
Comes to Greece, France wanted to avoid the drama that would have ensued with a Greek default, especially when you remember the consequences of Lehman Brothers' default. We achieved that.
Despite all the difficult conditions that we faced, with huge pressure on our shoulders, sometimes facing very strong countries within the European Union, we still managed to reach our goals. We negotiated a new program that will ensure funding needs until 2013 to find a solution to the question of recapitalizing Greek banks and making Greek debt viable by means of the strictest criteria made by the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
All right, so that was, of course, Angela Merkel, Sarkozy and George Papandreou, the Prime Minister of Greece, all reacting to today's deal. Harald Hau, I'd like to start with you, if I may. There have been major fears in recent months, as you well know. Some people even saying this could be the end of the road for the euro. Is this deal enough to allay those fears for the time being?
I think we are still not over this crisis, so this is just the first step in the right direction, I would say. On the write-down of Greece debt, I don't think it goes far enough. That's a continuing problem. I think an outright default would have been better, in fact. Now that the banks formally agreed to this write-down of 50%, a lot more haggling will go on, and it's not quite clear that the final terms will actually imply a 50% write-down. Last time they promised 21%, and if one looked at the detail, actually was something quite different. So one has to remain skeptical about the actual commitment there. An outright default would have given the rest of Europe, the political leadership, a much stronger hand against the banks. So that's probably a shortcoming. The other big issue is, of course, if this bailout fund will actually come about at the magnitude it was predicted and promised. One can be skeptical. This is a completely new structure, untested. Is there enough private capital available to scale up the public funds up to 1,000 billion? That's an open question. No one really knows right now.
All right, Fabienne Keller, if I can come to you. Are you happy with what Nicolas Sarkozy got for France in these agreements?
I think Europe won yesterday because there was a European agreement. It's not a battle between France and Germany. It's a battle for all Eurozone and all Europe to find a solution.
They have disagreements, haven't they, between France and Germany?
They have joined an agreement all together. So I think it's a big step forward. It was difficult to build. A situation, a country in Europe is in a quasi-bankruptcy. So how to help? And the good news is that the political aspect, it's not possible to leave Greece alone and like Lehman Brothers just say, just leave it alone and take it out of the euro. No, it's Europe, so we build the future together and we make what is necessary to recapitalize the Greek debt.
Even if that means France might lose its AAA rating and become less creditworthy on international markets?
Clearly, it puts a very heavy constraints on the French budget, as on the other European budgets, national budget. But the idea is we have a political project together. We have to go through this difficult time together, and we have to take the budgetary measures that go with it. We have probably to make more efforts for next year.
All right, let's go to New York and Georges Uger. You work in finance, Georges. So I'd like to get your view on what do you think about banks being told they are only going to get half of the money they were expecting?
Well, you have to put things in perspective. The banks have lent $32 billion to Greece. And I'm talking about the European banks. That's about 1/10 of the debt. Accepted a 21% discount, and now they accept a haircut of 50%. The difference is $10 billion. So we're not talking about huge sacrifices among all those banks, a few hundred millions here and there. My problem is that it is presented as if we had found a way to reduce the Greek debt by 50%. That's absolutely not true. We reduced the Greek debt by 5%.
So do you think it doesn't go far enough for Greece or the rest of the countries in the Eurozone?
I think the focus on the bank was the wrong focus. Of course they had to do something. They accepted it on the 21st of July. And if we had implemented the same glorious agreement winning for Europe from the 21st of July, now that we have the agreement of the parliaments, we wouldn't be where we are today. Now we have agreement, but we focus, as I say, on 10% of the debt. What will happen to the other 90%? Will the European central banks take a 50% haircut? Will the IMF take a 50% haircut? Will the insurance companies take 50% haircut? No word about that.
That's right, isn't it,
My understanding was that all private investors take a 50% haircut. Exactly. It's not just the banks. So
I understand the IMF, the IMF agreement are inviolable. They will get all of their money back.
The IMF is off, that's for sure. That's always been like that.
The European Stability Fund as well.
They will all get their money back, but the banks will not get all of their money back.
No, it's not happening that way. Let me be precise. The only agreement we have on the table is the one that has been negotiated with the IIF, and they expect 70% to accept the exchange. For the rest, it's a voluntary action, and there is absolutely no certainty whatsoever that other private, which by the way represent only 50% of the debt, will actually be exchanged.
I think it's going to go through the markets. The insurance have to give the right price to whatever they hold. If it's half price for the banks, then the market price is half price. So,
but if I think the point Georges is trying to make is if the shareholders in the banks don't agree that has been agreed by European leaders, then the banks can't go ahead with it because it's their money that they're holding. Is that right?
Ahead.
My understanding is that there was an agreement with the banks. So
yeah, but
exactly.
The banks,
there is an agreement with the bank.
The banks are not the crucial part. They hold only a small proportion of the overall debt. What is important is that we have an overall 50% write-down of all private debt. Yeah. And I'm not sure.
Well, we're talking a lot about haircuts, people taking haircuts, people taking losses. That's the banks, isn't it? Losing money.
Well, but that proportion of it is just pointed out. That's why the general default.
Half of it. 50% is half.
Well, no, I mean, 50. First of all, they are the public debt holders. This is essentially the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the fund so far. And they control now a large proportion already, maybe 40-50%. And the other 50% is private, of which the banks are only, in fact, a small share, only 20%. That brings 10%, what was just pointed out. And if we have a 50% write-down on 10%, that's actually irrelevant. That's marginal.
All right. George, what about the recapitalisation programme? How is that money going to be raised, first of all?
Well, as you can see from this morning, every bank has been going out saying, I don't need to raise money, I don't need to raise money. I'm absolutely fascinated by the market reaction. We have some banks going up 20% on the news that they will suffer and have to raise more equity. That's unheard of. I think the market has misread the situation, and I think it was a big mistake to put a timing of July 2012. The average equity ratio of the European banks is 4.5%. You don't go from 4.5% to 9% in 9 months. It is totally impossible.
That's not right. I mean, you always get if the price is right. So this idea that you cannot raise new capital, I think that's, from an economic point of view, pretty unjustifiable.
All right, I just want to talk about...
No.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I just want to talk about one more detail. Let's leave the banks aside for the moment. I want to talk about the EFSF, the stability mechanism it's basically a bailout fund that's been boosted to €1 trillion. It's obviously big enough to impress the markets, isn't it, Harold? But is it big enough to do what it's designed to do in that it's supposed to make borrowing costs lower in Spain and in Italy and in these other countries? It's supposed to stop contagion reaching there.
Well, if you actually read the proposal, it's completely unclear what the money is for. You have a whole spectrum of different intervention possibilities. You have intervention in the secondary market, basically what the ECB did so far. And the instruction was actually from the Bundesbank that all secondary market intervention by the ECB stop and now be replaced by this new fund. You can have primary market intervention, meaning that the EFSF can directly buy newly issued Italian debt. That's a possibility. And thirdly, we don't know whether this money can be used for bank recapitalization. So everything is open, and everything is to complete discretion of the managers of these funds and the governments. Every government has basically a veto power there.
Okay, let's go to Berlin. Daniela Schwartz, the head of research at the EU Integration Unit. Daniela, there seem to be a lot of uncertainties over this deal already.
That is absolutely true. I mean, if you read the conclusions of the Eurozone summit, it's obviously clear that we will have to wait for at least a few more weeks to understand precisely how the leveraging of the EFSF will work. And also, one of the previous speakers, he raised the question, what can the EFSF actually do? Now, this is interesting from a German perspective because with a lot of, let's say, political power from the government, the parliament just ratified the changed EFSF treaty based upon the July decision to actually enlarge the scope of instruments. And if we now sort of rethink about, for instance, a direct bank recapitalization through the EFSF, I guess from a German perspective, this would mean that if we again change its ability to act, we would need another political ratification of any new change to the EFSF agreement. So I think we are quite a long way from a moment where we actually know what kind of new powers and what kind of new volume we actually achieve for the EFSF. And this means, I think, as a conclusive line, while markets have been enthusiastic today, I guess we will head for another few weeks where the European Central Bank will actually be very active in the bond market, because it will be realized earlier or later that it will take a long till this mechanism can actually stabilize.
Well, you mentioned the European Central Bank, and there have been calls for the ECB to become a so-called lender of last resort, as the Federal Reserve is in the United States. One of the reasons that hasn't happened is reportedly because of German fears about hyperinflation. How much do you think that fear affected these negotiations?
The fear in Germany about high inflation is clearly there. I'm not saying it's rational, but it has ever since the euro was introduced. If you look at opinion poll data, people generally completely overestimate the inflation rate since the introduction of the euro, both for Germany and for the EMU as a whole. And unfortunately, this is also a kind of prejudice that is very present with policymakers. Apart from that, of course, there is a strong concern in Germany to bring the ECB back into its sort of initial role when the euro was introduced, of being a politically institution which doesn't meddle too much with economic and fiscal policy making, and which doesn't intervene, obviously, to that degree in bond markets. So the German concern is really to rather keep the ECB out of the game than to institutionalize it as an actor.
Yeah, exactly. For the Germans, it's only a monetary instrument. May I say that if technically we don't know exactly how the measures are going to be applied, we know that the European Stability Fund, which is very important, to 1 trillion, as previously said, that an action to banks, I think to any private investors, as we just previously said, will decrease the Greek debt. And third thing, that we are ready in Europe to work all together to save the euro and to save Greece.
But do you accept there are a lot of details that still need to be worked out? We are not at the point now where we have a deal that is going to resolve these issues in the long term.
Clearly, but if banks accept 50% of the value of what they have, everybody is obliged to do so because the market price is decreasing. So all the private assets are going to lose 50% of their value. And concerning the recapitalizing of bank, the main stream of money will come from their own results, because most of the banks has made marvelous results last year and have planned very good results in 2011, so they can, instead of distributing,
they can bonuses and dividends.
Exactly,
as
very high
Barroso
bonuses
and
very high dividends, billion of euros for all the main banks. They can keep this as a capital to give security to the land they give to the states or others. So it's very logic that they pay for the crisis they created.
All right, let's put that point to Georges Rouget. What do you say to that, Georges?
Well, I'm going to be pretty tough. First, that crisis is built by the governments and not by the bank. Second, the EFSF at 1 trillion means something that nobody has said, which is that France is going to put 120 billion euros of risk and debt on its own public debt and definitely lose its AAA. That Germany will put like 170 more, because everything is guaranteed by the member states. So what we have done is basically increase by 2.5 times the amount of guarantee that will have to be extended by the member states. And nobody's been talking about it. So I have a very serious problem also on the recapitalization through reserves. You don't recapitalize through reserves. You need either to reduce your assets or you need to raise capital. And I've seen one thing said, we won't pay dividends. So if banks don't pay dividends, how are they going to raise money?
Okay, we're gonna have to end on that thought just a moment, Harold. We will be back in a moment, and I'll let you respond to that. We are going to have to take a short break, though. When we come back, we'll have the headlines for you and the second part of tonight's debate. Don't go away.